Have you ever spent years building something with your own hands only to watch someone else accept the applause? Because that is exactly what happened to me. My name is Ethan Brooks. I am 36 years old, and for 12 years I poured every ounce of my life into keeping my family's restaurant alive. Not because anyone asked nicely, because if I didn't, everything would fall apart. The suppliers would have stopped delivering. Payroll would have bounced. The lights would have gone out. And yet, on the biggest night in our family's history, after everything I had sacrificed, my own father smiled into a microphone, looked straight past me, and introduced me to a room full of people as our accountant. Nothing more. The strange thing is, I didn't argue. I didn't make a speech. I didn't embarrass anyone. I simply stopped doing something I had been doing quietly for over a decade. 3 weeks later, everyone finally learned what I had really been carrying. By then, it was too late. People love successful family businesses because they imagine warmth. Recipes passed through generations. Holiday dinners. Laughing together after closing. That is the version customers see. The version behind the kitchen door looks very different. Our restaurant sat on the corner of Maple and 3rd in a small Colorado town where everyone knew your name before they knew your story. The sign read Brooks Family Grill. Most people assumed my father built it. Technically, he did. But surviving is different from opening. My dad, Frank Brooks, had always been the face of the restaurant. Customers adored him. He remembered birthdays. He shook every hand. He could convince strangers they had been friends for years. My older brother, Dylan, inherited that same gift. He worked the dining room like he was born under stage lights. People asked to sit in his section. Local reporters interviewed him. Photos of charity events always seemed to feature him standing beside my father. Then there was me. I was usually upstairs in the cramped office with peeling paint, surrounded by invoices, tax folders, payroll reports, repair estimates, and coffee cups that had gone cold hours earlier. Customers rarely knew I existed. Which, honestly, I thought was fine. Someone had to keep the numbers alive. Someone had to notice that the freezer compressor sounded different. Someone had to catch the utility company charging double. Someone had to negotiate with suppliers when beef prices jumped overnight. Someone had to stay until 2 in the morning balancing accounts after everyone else had gone home. That someone was always me. For years, I convinced myself I preferred it that way. Recognition felt unnecessary. If the restaurant survived, that was enough. Or at least that is what I kept telling myself. My mother used to say I was the dependable one. It sounded like a compliment. Eventually, I realized it was not. Dependable people become invisible. Nobody celebrates the person who quietly prevents disasters. They only notice when that person disappears. Every Christmas, my brother received expensive watches or golf clubs. I usually got a thank you handshake. Dad would grin and say, "Couldn't do this place without you, son." Then he would walk away before I could answer. Words are cheap. Raises were not. Ownership papers were not. Profit sharing was not. Somehow those conversations always became next year. There is always a next year when someone benefits from your patience. The first time I rescued the restaurant, I was 24. The bank had rejected a loan extension. Dad never told anyone. I found the notice buried under a stack of menus. We had 9 days before payroll. 9. I spent 72 straight hours reorganizing every expense. Canceled subscriptions nobody used. Renegotiated supplier contracts. Sold 2 unused delivery vans. Refinanced equipment. Called every creditor myself. By the following Friday, payroll cleared. Nobody missed a paycheck. The kitchen kept running. Customers kept ordering burgers without realizing the restaurant had nearly disappeared. That night Dad hugged Dylan in front of everyone and said great teamwork. No one mentioned where the money had come from. No one asked how we had survived. I told myself it did not matter. Someone had to be the grown-up. Years passed like that. Every crisis somehow found my desk. Broken oven. Call Ethan. Health inspection. Call Ethan. Insurance audit. Call Ethan. New payroll software. Ethan. Roof leaking. Ethan. Employee quit without notice. Ethan. State tax issue. Definitely Ethan. Whenever something actually worked, that belonged to someone else. The glowing online reviews praised my father's hospitality. Local magazines celebrated Dylan's leadership. Customers complimented the atmosphere. Nobody complimented spreadsheets. And honestly, I never expected them to. What hurt was not being ignored by strangers. It was realizing my own family had started believing the same story everyone else saw. That Dad built everything. That Dylan ran everything. That I organized paperwork. They truly believed it. And maybe that was my fault. I had spent years solving problems before anyone noticed they existed. When people never see the fire, they assume there was not one. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, our longtime produce supplier called me directly. His voice sounded nervous. "Ethan, I wanted to give you a heads up." "About what?" "I heard your dad is announcing retirement." I laughed. "No, he is not." There was silence. "I thought you knew." My stomach tightened. Apparently, I did not. That evening I walked downstairs after closing and found balloons scattered around the dining room. Dylan stood on a ladder hanging a banner that said 50 years of Brooks Family Grill. Dad looked happier than I had seen him in months. "There he is," he said. "We are throwing a huge anniversary celebration." I smiled and said, "Sounds great." Dad clapped me on the shoulder and said, "We will need your help." Of course they would. Not because they wanted my opinion, because they needed someone to make impossible things happen. I looked around the restaurant. Everyone else was discussing decorations, guest lists, music, television interviews. Nobody had mentioned a budget. Nobody had mentioned permits. Nobody had mentioned staffing. Nobody had mentioned insurance. Nobody had mentioned where the money was coming from. I already knew who would. Me. Again. I opened my laptop that night and created a spreadsheet titled 50th Anniversary Gala. For a long moment, my fingers rested above the keyboard. Then, for the first time in 12 years, a single question entered my mind. Not how much this event would cost. Not how we would afford it. Something much simpler. If this restaurant could not survive without me, why was I the only one acting like I could be replaced? The anniversary dinner was still 6 weeks away. That should have been plenty of time. Instead, by the end of the first planning meeting, I already knew we were headed for trouble. Dylan leaned back in his chair with the confidence of someone spending money that was not his and said we should invite the mayor. Dad nodded immediately and said, "And the Chamber of Commerce." "Definitely." Dylan continued. "What about the local news? Imagine the publicity." Everyone loved the idea. I quietly added another line to my spreadsheet. Additional catering, $4,200. Nobody noticed. Then my father smiled at me and said, "You will figure out the details." It was not a question. It never was. Over the next month, my days became a blur. I negotiated with vendors before sunrise, met electricians during lunch, interviewed temporary servers in the afternoon, reviewed permits after dinner, balanced payroll close to midnight. Meanwhile, Dylan posted cheerful updates online almost every day saying big things coming. So grateful to celebrate 50 amazing years. Cannot wait to show everyone what we have been working on. We. That word bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Because every picture showed Dylan tasting desserts, shaking hands, choosing decorations, standing beside Dad. Meanwhile, I was sitting in a storage room comparing insurance policies and emergency evacuation requirements. There was not much to photograph. Nobody posts pictures of liability forms. About 3 weeks before the celebration, I discovered something that made my stomach sink. The entertainment company Dylan had hired required a 50% deposit within 48 hours. Almost $20,000. He had not mentioned it. He had simply assumed the restaurant had enough cash available. It did not. Not without risking payroll. I walked downstairs and found him chatting with customers near the front counter. "Dylan," I said. He smiled and said, "What is up?" "The band deposit," I told him. "Oh yeah," he replied. "It is due Thursday." So where is the money coming from?" He shrugged and said, "You always figure that stuff out." Those words stayed with me the rest of the day. You always figure that stuff out. Not can we solve this together? Not what do you need? Just confidence that somehow I would make reality obey. That evening I stayed in the office long after everyone left. Stacks of invoices covered my desk. I stared at the cash flow report until the numbers blurred together. There was only one solution. Delay several equipment upgrades. Postpone replacing 2 aging refrigerators. Dip into the emergency reserve I had spent years building. Again. It was not smart. It was not safe. But it would work. At least for now. I clicked transfer funds. The confirmation appeared. Crisis avoided. No applause. No announcement. Just another invisible disaster quietly erased. A few days later, our head chef, Maria, knocked on my office door. She had worked at Brooks Family Grill longer than I had. Maybe longer than anyone besides my parents. She closed the door behind her and said, "You look exhausted." "I am fine," I said. She raised an eyebrow and said, "No, you are surviving." There was a difference. She knew it. So did I. Maria sat across from me and asked, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure," I replied. "If you disappeared for a month?" I laughed and said the place would collapse. She did not smile. "I am serious," she said. "So am I," I answered. She folded her hands and asked, "Then why does everyone act like you are optional?" I did not answer. Because I did not have one. As the anniversary approached, reporters started calling. They wanted interviews about the restaurant's 50-year history. Dad loved every minute of it. Dylan loved it even more. One afternoon, I walked through the dining room carrying payroll reports just as a television crew finished filming. The reporter smiled politely and asked, "Oh, are you with accounting?" Before I could answer, Dylan stepped in and said, "My little brother handles the books." Little brother. The words hit harder than they should have. Not operations director. Not financial manager. Not partner. Not the person who had kept the doors open more times than anyone knew. Just the guy with spreadsheets. The camera turned away. The interview continued without me. That night I drove home instead of staying late. Something I almost never did. My apartment felt strangely quiet. For years I had been too tired to notice silence. Now it filled every room. I opened an old filing cabinet looking for tax records. Instead, I found something else. A faded notebook. Inside were handwritten pages from my first year at the restaurant. Goals. Ideas. Expansion plans. Dreams. One page stopped me cold. Across the top I had written, "Someday, Dad and I will run this place together." Together. I sat there staring at those words for several minutes. I had almost forgotten that young man. He believed hard work naturally led to respect. He believed loyalty earned trust. He believed families noticed sacrifice. Life had taught me otherwise. The next morning, Dad asked me to meet him before opening. For a moment, I actually felt hopeful. Maybe this was it. Maybe he wanted to talk about succession, ownership, the future. Instead, he handed me another folder and said we are increasing the guest list. I flipped it open. 32 additional names. 32? Dad, we are already over budget. He waved his hand dismissively and said people spend money to celebrate milestones. I know, I replied, but someone has to pay for them. He smiled and said that is why I have got you. He walked away before I could answer. I looked down at the guest list. Every extra invitation meant more tables, more food, more staff, more costs, more pressure. And somehow still no seat for me in the conversations that mattered. That afternoon, as I updated the budget for what felt like the 100th time, I noticed something I had not seen before. Every line on the spreadsheet represented money. But nowhere, not once, had I written down what this celebration was costing me. Not financially. Personally. Maybe that was the account I had been avoiding all along. And for the first time in 12 years, I wondered what would happen if I finally looked at the real balance. The anniversary gala was only 5 days away. The restaurant had never looked better. Fresh paint covered the dining room walls. New light fixtures glowed above the booths. The patio had been transformed with string lights and flower boxes that made the entire place look twice its age in the best possible way. Customers kept stopping to admire the changes, saying, "Looks incredible. You guys must be proud. You have really built something special." Every compliment drifted toward my father and Dylan. I smiled every time. I had gotten good at smiling. 2 days before the event, the florist called and said there seems to be a problem with the payment. I frowned and asked what kind of problem. "The card on file has reached its authorization limit," she replied. I immediately opened the restaurant accounts. Another surprise. The emergency reserve I had protected for years was almost gone. Equipment repairs, unexpected advertising expenses, decor upgrades, premium entertainment, extra catering. Every decision that had sounded exciting in meetings had quietly drained the business. No one besides me had noticed. Because no one besides me ever checked. I spent the next 3 hours moving money between accounts just to keep everything alive until the celebration ended. Again. That afternoon Maria found me staring at my monitor and asked, "You solved it?" "I always do," I replied. She crossed her arms and said, "That is not what I asked." I looked up and said, "What do you mean?" "I asked if you are okay," she said. The question caught me off guard. It had been years since anyone asked it. I leaned back in my chair and asked, "You ever feel like you have become really good at something nobody values?" Maria laughed softly and said, "Every chef in America has felt that." I could not help smiling. Then she became serious and said, "But there is a difference between not getting applause and not getting respect." Those words stayed with me. Respect. When had I stopped expecting it? The following morning, I arrived before sunrise. The restaurant was silent. I loved those quiet hours. No customers. No ringing phones. Just coffee, paperwork, and the sound of refrigerators humming in the background. I walked through the dining room checking every table. Straightened crooked chairs, adjusted centerpieces, tested the microphones, verified emergency exits. Most people never notice details like that. They only notice when something goes wrong. I suppose that had become my entire life. Preventing disasters nobody would ever know existed. Around noon, Dad called everyone together and said the newspaper wants one last interview before the gala. Reporters arrived 30 minutes later. They filmed the kitchen, the dining room, old family photographs. Then they interviewed my father. He spoke about hard work, tradition, family. After him came Dylan. He talked about the future, growth, community. Finally, the reporter turned toward me and asked, "So what role do you play here?" Before I could answer, Dad chuckled and said, "Oh, Ethan? He is our numbers guy. He keeps us organized." Everyone laughed politely. The interview moved on. That was it. 12 years. Reduced to one sentence. He keeps us organized. Nobody meant to hurt me. That somehow made it worse, because it meant they genuinely believed that was all I contributed. That evening I could not sleep. Around midnight I drove back to the restaurant. I had done that hundreds of times over the years. Sometimes I just liked seeing the building when it was empty. It reminded me why I stayed. I unlocked the back door. The dining room looked beautiful beneath the dim lights. Every table was already dressed for the celebration. Crystal glasses, fresh flowers, gold napkins embroidered with the restaurant's anniversary logo. I slowly walked from one end of the room to the other, remembering the first payroll I had saved. The first holiday season we actually made a profit. The night a pipe burst in January and I spent 14 hours cleaning frozen water before opening. The pandemic months when I worked without taking a paycheck because the staff needed theirs more. Nobody knew that. Not even Dad. I had simply transferred money from my personal savings into the business account and never mentioned it. At the time it felt like what family does. Standing there alone, I realized something painful. The restaurant knew me better than my own family did. Every wall held memories of sacrifices no one had witnessed. The next morning my younger cousin, Mason, stopped by unexpectedly. He had recently graduated from college and wanted career advice. We grabbed coffee before opening. "I have always admired what you have built here," he said. I almost laughed and asked, "What do you think I have built?" He looked confused and said, "The business. Dylan told everyone you are basically retired from operations." I stared at him and said, "What?" "He said he handles most of it now," Mason added. For several seconds I could not speak. Then I asked quietly, "Did you believe him?" Mason shrugged and said, "I mean, that is what everyone says." Everyone. Not just strangers. Family. Friends. The community. An entire story had been written about our restaurant. And somehow I was not one of the main characters anymore. The anniversary arrived on a warm Saturday evening. Cars filled every parking space before sunset. Television cameras waited outside. Local business owners gathered near the entrance. The mayor arrived exactly on time. Inside, the restaurant buzzed with excitement. Servers moved quickly, musicians tuned their instruments, champagne glasses sparkled beneath the lights. Everything worked perfectly, exactly as planned, because I had spent weeks making sure it would. I checked one last list. Food temperatures, staff assignments, vendor payments, emergency contacts. Everything complete. For the first time in days, I took a deep breath. Maybe tonight would finally be different. Maybe Dad would introduce everyone. Maybe he would tell the truth. Maybe he would say Ethan made this possible. Not because I wanted applause. Because I wanted to know my family saw me. Just once. Just one honest sentence. As guests began filling the dining room, I adjusted my tie and stepped toward the entrance. Dad stood beside Dylan, greeting everyone with wide smiles. Then I heard him say something that made me stop in my tracks. "There he is, our accountant finally made it." The guests laughed warmly. Dad was not trying to insult me. He was introducing me exactly the way he genuinely saw me. In that single moment I realized the hardest truth of all. You cannot change how someone values you by working harder. Sometimes the harder you work in silence, the easier it becomes for people to believe your work does not matter. And I had no idea that before the night was over, one quiet decision would force everyone in that room to discover exactly what my silence had been worth. The dining room erupted in applause as my father welcomed everyone. 50 years. 5 decades. 3 generations. The speeches were heartfelt. Customers wiped away tears. Old employees shared stories. The mayor presented a plaque honoring the restaurant's contribution to the community. I stood near the back wall. Not hiding, just existing, exactly where I had spent most of my life. Invisible enough that people only noticed me when they needed something. Dinner service began flawlessly. Every course arrived on time. The kitchen moved like clockwork. Servers never missed a table. The live band sounded perfect. Months of preparation had created one seamless evening. No one knew how close the entire operation had come to collapsing more than once. That is the thing about quiet work. When you do it well, people assume it was easy. Halfway through dinner, the local news reporter approached me and smiled politely, asking, "So, what exactly do you handle here?" For a moment, the old version of me almost answered, "Just accounting." Instead, I smiled and said, "I help wherever I am needed." She thanked me and moved on. I watched her interview Dylan instead. He spoke confidently about leadership, vision, growth. Words I had spent years turning into reality while he delivered them with effortless charm. Oddly enough, I was not angry anymore. I was simply tired. Dessert arrived. The anniversary cake rolled into the dining room as everyone counted down 3, 2, 1. Cheers exploded as my parents cut the first slice. Then my father raised his glass and said I could not be prouder of this family. He turned toward Dylan and said, "My son has carried this restaurant into the future." Another round of applause. Then he glanced in my direction and smiled warmly, saying, "And of course we could not do it without our accountant." That was it. One sentence. After 12 years. The room applauded politely. No one noticed that my smile had disappeared. Because I finally understood something. They were not overlooking me by accident. They genuinely believed the story they had repeated for years. The reliable one. The quiet one. The accountant. Nothing more. I reached into my jacket pocket and felt my phone vibrate. It was a notification from the bank. The restaurant's operating account had officially dropped below the emergency threshold I had always maintained. There was not enough cash left to cover next month's supplier invoices. No one else knew. No one else even checked those numbers. As always, only I did. I looked around the room. Everyone was celebrating success. I was looking at a business heading toward a financial cliff. Again. Only this time I did not feel responsible. That realization startled me. For years I believed loving my family meant saving them from every consequence. But love is not the same thing as rescuing people from decisions they never have to own. After dessert, guests gathered near the stage for photographs. Dad waved me over and said, "Ethan, come stand on the end." On the end. Just enough to be in the picture. Not enough to matter. I walked toward the stage, then stopped. For the first time in my life, I chose differently. "I am okay," I said calmly. "You all go ahead." Dad looked confused and asked, "You sure?" I nodded and said, "Yeah." The family photo was taken without me. Ironically, it looked exactly like every version of our family I had carried in my head for years. Complete without me. And somehow seeing it made something inside me peaceful instead of broken. The next morning I arrived before anyone else. I unlocked the office, made coffee, opened every financial file I had maintained for over a decade. Supplier contacts, payroll systems, insurance renewals, vendor agreements, equipment schedules. Everything lived inside my head. No one had ever asked me to document it. Because no one imagined I would ever leave. I spent 6 hours organizing every process into clear manuals. Every password, every renewal date, every contract, every procedure. When I finished, I placed everything into neatly labeled binders. Then I typed a single-page letter. Effective today, I am resigning from Brooks Family Grill. I am grateful for everything this restaurant has taught me. All financial records and operational procedures have been organized for an orderly transition. I sincerely wish everyone continued success. No accusations, no blame, no anger, just facts. For the first time, I let the business belong to the people who believed they were already running it. Dad found the letter an hour later. Ethan, he walked into my office holding the envelope. What is this? My resignation, I said. He laughed and said no, seriously. I am serious, I replied. His smile slowly disappeared and he said you cannot leave. I looked at him quietly and asked why not. Because, he searched for an answer. Because payroll, suppliers, taxes, scheduling, licenses, insurance, repairs, budgets. The things no one applauds. The things no one photographs. The things they had quietly expected me to carry forever. For the first time, he could not finish the sentence. 3 weeks later, I heard through Maria that reality had arrived. Invoices had been missed. 2 vendor contracts had expired. Payroll had to be delayed by 2 days. Nothing catastrophic. Just enough for everyone to realize how much invisible work had always existed. Dad called several times. I answered once. I understand now, he said softly. I do not think we ever realized. I know, I replied. I am sorry, he said. There was a long silence. Finally, he asked, would you come back? I looked around my new office. Not above a restaurant this time. A consulting firm I had started with 2 former clients who believed operations mattered just as much as appearances. I smiled and said no. Not because I hated him. Because I had finally learned the difference between helping and disappearing. Months later, I visited Brooks' Family Grill as an ordinary customer. No clipboard, no invoices, no emergency phone calls, just dinner. A young hostess walked me to a table. She did not know who I was. Neither did most of the staff. Oddly, it felt wonderful. For the first time in years, I was not responsible for everyone's experience. Only my own. As I finished my meal, Maria walked over carrying a slice of chocolate pie. She placed it in front of me and said, on the house. I laughed and said I did not order this. I know, she smiled. Sometimes people deserve dessert without earning it. I stared at the pie for a second longer than I should have. Then I took the first bite. It tasted different. Not because the recipe had changed. Because I finally had. Looking back now, I do not think the hardest part was being overlooked. The hardest part was believing my value depended on how much I sacrificed. It does not. Real respect is not something you earn by exhausting yourself. Real love does not require you to disappear so someone else can shine. If people only notice you when you stop carrying everything, they were never appreciating your strength, they were depending on your silence. So let me ask you something. Have you ever been the person quietly holding everything together while someone else accepted the credit? If you have, what finally made you put the weight down? I would genuinely love to read your story in the comments.